Hello everyone, it's me Syed Faraz Hussain Naqvi from Institute of Regional Studies, Islamabad. I am currently leading the Iran program at the Institute of Regional Studies, Islamabad, and on the behalf of Institute, I welcome you all on this very prevalent topic titled The Proposed Saudi-Iran Maritime Security Cooperation, an Alternative to I2U2. So as we all know that in March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran has finally agreed to resolve their bilateral issues and conflict in the Middle East by a rapprochement, which was mediated by China. And it was a sort of a watershed moment in the history of Middle East, which was an otherwise turbulent region. But for the past 3 to 4 years, we have been saying that there is a reconciliatory approach between various states and stakeholders. So to consolidate their rapprochement, both Saudi Arabia and Iran has reopened their embassies after nearly 7 years of deadlock. And also Saudi Arabia welcomed the Iranian partner in the Middle East, Syria, into the Arab League after nearly a decade. Furthermore, we have also seen that there is a sort of peace process going on over the issue of Yemen after the visit of Saudi Arabian delegation to the Yemeni capital Sana'a. So all these developments hinted that there have been a sense of rapprochement, and there have been a sense of reconciliation and peace, and a mutual consensus have been developed to jointly lead the entire region towards progress and development. Saudi foreign minister has also proposed on his visit to Iran that there could be a possibility of a joint maritime security cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia to secure the region of Persian Gulf and the nearby areas. If it is materialized, it would be a second unilateral alliance in the Middle East after the I2U2, which was led by US and joined by India, UAE, and Israel. So this could be a very interesting event if it is materialized, that at one corner we have been seeing that there is a US-led maritime cooperation by the name I2U2, and then we have been seeing an indigenous form of security apparatus led by both Saudi Arabia and Iran. And considering the Iran factor, we can also assume that China could also be a member of this maritime cooperation, since the rapprochement between Iran and Saudi Arabia was basically mediated by China. So given all this scenario, it is to be witnessed that whether this maritime security cooperation would actually be materialized, and if so, would it be able to resolve the Middle Eastern conflict, or it would create a sort of friction between a US-led group and then the indigenous group in which China is present? Would it be able to dissolve the conflicts, or would it replicate into a Sino-US competition in the Middle East? To have further elaboration on this topic, we are joined by a very honorable, esteemed, and distinguished speaker all the way from Washington, D.C., Mr. Alex Vatanka. Let me introduce our esteemed speaker. So Mr. Alex Vatanka is basically the founding director of Iran program at Middle East Institute, Washington, D.C. He specializes in Middle Eastern regional security affairs with particular focus on Iran. He was formerly a senior analyst at Jane's Information Group in London. Mr. Alex is also a senior fellow in Middle Eastern Studies at the US Air Force Special Operations School, as well as a professor at DISAS at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Mr. Alex has testified before the US Congress and lectured widely for both governmental and commercial audiences, including US Department of State and Defense, US intelligence agencies, and a list of international corporations. Born in Tehran, he holds a BA in Political Science from Sheffield University, UK, and MA in International Relations from Essex University, UK. He is also fluent in Persian, Danish, and English. He has so far authored 2 books, and the title of both of them are The Battle of Ayatollahs in Iran, The United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. And the second book which he authored is Iran and Pakistan, Security, Diplomacy, and American Influence. His third book is currently underway, which is titled Iran's Arab Strategy, Defending the Homeland or Exporting Humanism. I welcome you, Mr. Alex, and thank you so much for joining us on this quite relevant topic and sparing time for this lecture. We are truly honored and grateful for by your presence. So the floor is all yours, sir.
Thank you so much, Fraz. Thank you for that warm introduction. Thanks to you and the Institute for inviting me. I look forward to our panel today. I will try and be brief, 15 minutes or so, hopefully not much more than that. I'll say some, some of the thinking that I have made since you proposed this topic for discussion, and really look forward to the discussion with those joining us today. But Fraz, let me get straight to the topic here at hand. The title is Iran-Saudi Gulf Maritime Security Cooperation, an alternative to I2U2. So when you send that to me, right away, the thing that I had to establish in my head is, what do they have in common? And I think it's very clear that what they have in common, that essentially both of them are, as of today, abstract ideas. They haven't been implemented, certainly not in the case of the Iran-Saudi Gulf Maritime Security. That is just an idea, a suggestion. I2U2 has seen more progress, has been around longer. There's been summits held around this topic involving heads of state, including President Biden and his counterparts from UAE, India, and Israel. But I think essentially, we're talking about abstract ideas here. We're in very early days in both cases, and certainly in the case of Iran Gulf maritime security, which is going to be the key focus of my remarks today. I like to examine the issue of this proposal in the context of what led to the rapprochement, Fraz, as you pointed, between Iran and Saudi Arabia over the last few years, which, as you pointed out, culminated in the March 2023 agreement. So let me just start off by putting out what I think is the bigger context here. As I said, they are largely just abstract ideas as of today. They're proposals. We'll have to wait and see whether they will go anywhere. But we're essentially talking about very different trends and realities in the case of a maritime security cooperation between Iran and Saudi and the I2U2 framework. I believe that, and I think most of us would agree, this is hardly a controversial point I'm about to make, but this security cooperation as an idea is a minimum step, part of a minimum understanding for the sake of cooperation that one has to assume will happen between Iran and the Gulf states, in this case, Saudi Arabia, if they are serious about continuing down the path of de-escalation. It's essentially, you could even call it step number 2, if we assume that step number 1, in order to allow for this de-escalation to happen, was for the Iranian side to agree that they would ask their friends in the Houthi movement in Yemen to stop targeting missiles at Saudi Arabia. That has happened. The ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and Yemen is in place. That, if you could call that the bare minimum, well, I would say the idea of security cooperation between Iran and Saudi in the realm of maritime cooperation is in the same spirit. It's not a major step. It's not going to create a new wonderful economic momentum for integration. It's a bare step that you need to be able to keep the political dialogue alive. Now, once you got your political dialogue alive, you can then hope for economic cooperation, or in this case, military security cooperation. But we still have some ways to go. And if you want to look at this, the idea of maritime security cooperation between Iran and Saudi and compare that to what I2U2 stands for, let me just highlight, what I2U2 really essentially is about. This is bringing Israel, India, UAE, and US together since the year 2021. It is surely a very ambitious agenda in terms of its vision. It essentially aims to deepen cooperation among the states, centered around such issues as water, energy, transportation, space, health, and food security. Very specific. On a geopolitical level, I2U2's helped the United States and Israel cement their relations in the Middle East, bring more friends into that partnership, including, obviously, in this case, United Arab Emirates, which is already part of the Abraham Accords. That's on the geopolitical level, but it also has another branch to it, and that branch is to help the United States and partners to sort of, if you will, stand up if there is a need for it against any threats, perceived competition coming from China, as this US-China power competition is likely to stay with us for a while and even maybe intensify. So some have even compared I2U2 to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Again, that's a major Chinese, effort that's been going on for about 10 years now, about $1 trillion of investments. So if you want to put I2U2 in the same category as Road and Belt Initiative, you can see where I'm going with this. The idea of a maritime security cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia is way off. There's no comparison to be had. So I would politely remind us maybe not to examine this issue in this context as much. I think we're talking very different trends and realities when we're talking about Iranian-Saudi maritime cooperation, the possibility of, and what I2U2 is all about, and how much potential it has going forward. This takes me to the core focus of my remarks the next few minutes, which is on why did we get to where we are today? As you pointed out, Faraz, after 7 years, why is Iran and Saudi Arabia engaged in this process of rapprochement? And again, just to remind everyone, we are still very much in the early days of this rapprochement. The Iranian side has returned, as I understand it, the ambassador to Saudi Arabia. But Saudi Arabia still is working on reopening its embassy. That just gives you a sense of how much work is ahead in this rapprochement for it to succeed. But nonetheless, here's some key realities that led us to the March 2023 agreement. This Iranian-Saudi dialogue was in the making for at least 2 years. I would say since the Al-Ula agreement was made in January 2021, Riyadh looked to get rid of the other major headache it had, which is its contentious relations with Iran. So once the Qatar, UAE, Saudi, Bahrain dispute was sort of resolved as part of the Al-Ula agreement, the Saudis turned their attention to the other major issue that they needed to resolve, which was the tensions they had with Iran. And I think that's why you had a number of rounds of discussions held mostly in Iraq between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And I think, this was a trend that was already moving before President Biden came to office. But I think as soon as he came to office, the sense in Saudi Arabia was that there was at the time a belief that a new Iran nuclear deal with the US was likely to happen. The Saudis didn't want to be seen by the Iranians or by the Americans as spoilers, so they kind of became supporters of these nuclear talks. At least on the public level, they expressed support, where in the past they had been dismayed by what the Saudis called an American decision to keep them out of consulting them, essentially, when the first nuclear deal was reached in 2015. This time around, by 2019-20, certainly by 21 when Biden is in the White House, the Saudis are not playing that role. They're supporting the nuclear talks. They didn't, as I said earlier, didn't want to have to be seen as spoilers. And they have stayed this course. Saudi Arabia has stayed the course vis-a-vis Iran, despite the fact that there hasn't been a new nuclear deal. That hasn't stopped the Saudis from wanting to have their own separate track of détente or rapprochement with Tehran. And I think fundamentally that goes to a reckoning, if you will, in Riyadh. And that reckoning is that their Iran policy, the Saudi Iran policy, for too long had been too heavily dependent on the actions of the United States. And this new Saudi leadership of the last 7 years, certainly with the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, has a very distinct vision. That vision is heavily focused on economic development. And to be able to succeed in the economic field, the Saudis early on decided that such realities as them being involved in Yemen war or tensions with the Iranians was going to always undermine their bigger objective, their economic development. So for those reasons, the Saudis decided to kind of, if you will, separate their path from the United States on Iran. And I think that has been the case certainly the last couple of years. And I will also point out that, you know, at the maximum, what the Saudis witnessed, because they had high hopes for President Trump when he was in office, that President Trump could change Iranian behavior. The maximum pressure campaign of President Trump was in many ways Saudi Arabia's last big hope for the United States to make Iran behave, if you will. And we all know what happened to the maximum pressure campaign. That was essentially a failure. The Iranian regime did not fall. All you saw was, you know, in one case, spectacular assassination of General Qasem Soleimani, which, you know, obviously made headlines, but really didn't change the realities on the ground. The Iranian regime stayed intact. Iranian involvement in the region remained the same. And the Saudis were sitting at this point, scratching their heads and saying to themselves, if this is the most, even closest like-minded friends of ours and the Trump administration can do for us, then it's really not good. Saudi Arabia needs to have a plan B, and that plan B is where we are today, the so-called process of détente and rapprochement. Saudi motivations, as I said before, is really, you know, heavily dependent on helping the economic vision of the new leadership, or the leadership that today calls the shots. I mean, you've heard the concepts such as Vision 2030. You've seen all the things that Saudi Arabia has been in the news for in the last few months and years. A major effort to connect with the youth, to create a Saudi national identity, to stop spending money on these you know, proxy competitions in the region from Lebanon to Syria to Iraq. It's a very different Saudi approach to the region. And this is in many ways the biggest challenge for the Iranian regime, because the Iranian regime says it wants to fix its economy, but really doesn't have the vision for it. And it's too isolated to do much about it. The Saudis have open hands. They're not sanctioned. They can deal with the world. They can raise money. They can bring investors in. They can do all the sort of things that Iran wish it could do. But Iranian foreign policy is still stuck, essentially in the 1980s, 1990s, even, you know, the last 10 years post-Arab Spring, where Iran intervened in the region. It has proven to be costly. It's one major reason why Iran is isolated from the West. But long story short, the Saudis didn't have those limitations. They could go in a different way, but they couldn't afford to have a neighbor, a large neighbor like Iran, to act as a spoiler for them, to sort of sit there and, as you will, throw stones at Saudi economic projects in the shape of potential, you know, kinetic military drone attacks and so forth, as we saw in 2019 with the attack on the Saudi facilities in Eastern Province. This is essentially, I think, why the Saudis have moved in the direction of aiming to tame, if you will, Iran. Because look, there hasn't been anything significant achieved so far since March. No major deals have been announced, not to my knowledge. Saudi Arabia hasn't invested billions of dollars in Iran. That was one of the early promises of the Saudi finance minister. Hasn't really happened. And, you know, there are good reasons for that. I'm happy to get into that discussion if folks are interested. But my point is, the Saudis so far have gotten more out of this detente the Iranian side, because the Saudis have essentially made it impossible for the Iranians to be seen to be behind any kind of missile or drone attack on Saudi facilities. Iran can't afford to do that right now because for its own reasons, Iran needs the rapprochement to succeed. And the Saudis are happy, obviously, to see that, and they haven't been asked to pay much in return. Again, you know, one of the reasons, and this, let me turn quickly to, actually, let me make 2 points, and I turn to Iranian calculations here. Saudi Arabia, it's important to remember, was not the only country here to turn to the idea of détente rapprochement with Iran in this time frame. I remember hearing Dr. Gargash in Abu Dhabi in 2020 talking about the need to turn the page and start over with Iran. That this, you know, we cannot have relations with Iran of zero-sum competition and enmity. This isn't good for the region. So Saudi Arabia is not the only country in the Gulf states, among the Gulf states, that's been thinking like that. UAE's done the same thing, and we've seen since Bahrain is also looking to de-escalate with Iran. The other thing is, I think there was a renewed sense of fear in some ways when the Iranians started acting, in my view at least, recklessly by supporting the military campaign of Russia in Ukraine. The fact that suddenly the Saudis woke up to the reality of Iranian drones in the hands of Russia engaged, being deployed in the conflict in Ukraine, created a new sort of sense of how reckless Iran could be. And again, if you're Saudi Arabia, if you're trying to fix your economy, if you have a long-term economic plan, you really need to talk to that neighbor of yours, in this case, Iran, that might act irresponsibly. So they raise the cost for Iran and hoping that they could, as I put it earlier, tame the Iranian side and to the extent possible, neutralize any threats coming from Iran against Saudi economic interests. Iranian motives, very quickly, I'm going to hopefully wrap up soon here. 2 major reasons why Iran went this in direction of détente. One is, there's an Iranian neighborhood policy, so-called neighborhood policy. President Ibrahim Raisi likes to claim this neighborhood policy of his own. The fact is that Hassan Rouhani started this neighborhood policy, which essentially is to focus more on neighboring states, countries like Pakistan, trade more with them, deal more with them, because that essentially in practical terms over the last 10, 15 years has proven to be one of the best ways to go around American sanctions, right? It's easier to go around sanctions when you have land border or you can get your goods back and forth closer to home in terms of geography than if you were shipping your oil to South Korea or Japan or India. Further away, easier for US sanctions enforcement to kick in and prevent that sort of trade. So that's essentially why the neighborhood policy was conceived, in many ways as a response to US sanctions. The other thing is, there was a realization on the part of the Iranians that Saudi Arabia is actually a pretty formidable foe, that, it's a country with capacity to hurt Iran. And one way the Saudis, at least from an Iranian perspective, were hurting Iran was their support for the Iranian opposition in diaspora, principally the media campaign. I don't want to name names. I think people who follow this should know it. But I mean, there was one particular channel that the Iranians felt was instrumental in the last few months in terms of protests that were happening in Iran, instrumental in mobilizing the angry Iranian public. And that channel was seen by Tehran, probably rightly so, significantly invested in financially by the Saudis. So that was one of their asks, if you will. That was one of the Iranian demands, that if there is going to be a successful process rapprochement, we do want to see Saudi Arabia rethink its support for some of these Iranian opposition groups. So the Iranians had their own calculations when it came to wanted to talk with the Saudis. But I just want to, again, put these 2 realities next to each other. Saudi Arabia has long-term major economic plan. Whether it will succeed or not remains to be seen, but it's much more ambitious than what you have on the Iranian side. The Iranian side, it's about surviving the sanctions. It's about, the bare minimum of survival of the regime, of take away support, financial support for the Iranian opposition. There is nothing grand about what Iran is thinking in terms of Saudi Arabia, not that I can see. I think those people who are perhaps thinking that the Iranian-Saudi rapprochement is the beginning of economic integration in the Middle East in ways that, for example, Europe has experienced in Second World War. We're a long way from that. That sort of economic vision doesn't exist in the minds of the Iranian leaders. You have it in Riyadh. You don't really have it in Tehran. The Iranian regime is still very much focused on security, regime survival, and obviously the two big elephants in the room for them is they haven't resolved their differences with the United States. They cannot get to change their policy on Israel, two issues that will keep Iran isolated forever and ever, as far as I can tell. Certainly here in Washington, even if you had a nuclear deal tomorrow between the United States and Iran, the issue of Israel will keep the United States Congress from becoming essentially a supporter of Iran, and will do its best to keep Iran isolated. So there are no answers in Tehran to those hard issues that are in the way. So instead, what you've seen on the Iranian side is to look east, as they call it, the look east policy, and hope that Russia and China will help them survive the fallout of Iran with the West. To some extent, that has worked. You've seen the numbers recently come out, 1.6 million barrels of oil exported by Iran, mostly going to China. So China is essentially saving the Iranian economy. I have to add that the Chinese get a nice discount per barrel of oil. I mean, you can take different numbers that exist out there about the size of this discount, but the 25% discount per barrel, it's quite significant. So China is actually making a nice little save here, been buying oil from Iran because the Iranians don't have any major customers out there. Few words really on China's role before turning to wrap up. The idea that only China could have mediated, I think, as I pointed out, the Iranians and the Saudis were already talking. Was it necessary to have this agreement announced in China in March of this year? They could have announced it somewhere else. They chose China because I think both Iran and Saudi Arabia did want to make the Chinese look good for various reasons. The Iranians obviously wanted to prove their credentials to their Chinese friends as good allies that are cooperative and would want to help China in its bigger Middle Eastern interest. And there's no doubt that China's economic interests are greater in Saudi Arabia today than they are in Iran. But the Iranians had no way of turning Saudi Arabia down turning China down as Iran came under pressure from Beijing in terms of its some of its actions in the region. Let me give you one example so I can sort of put more color on that argument. Again, in 2019, when the Iranians attacked the Aramco facilities, this is what I'm telling you is based on Iranian sources in open media. This isn't something that I was privy to privately. This is all public knowledge. The Chinese, after these Iranian attacks on Aramco, turned around and said, hey, Iran, wonderful, you got some very effective drones and missiles, but please remember, when you hit those facilities, when you hit Saudi Arabia, you're hitting our economic interest. And if you're sitting in Tehran, that's a clear sign that China actually doesn't want to see Iran go out there on a rampage hurting Saudi Arabia because of the extent of Chinese economic interest in Saudi Arabia. And because Iran really doesn't have anybody else to turn to, they have no way of saying no to China. So that is Chinese leverage. That is the sort of reason why China might be able to keep this rapprochement going forward because of the economic leverage that, for different reasons, China has both over Iran and Saudi Arabia. Let me say a few points and then I'll stop, Fraz, then looking forward to the conversation. It's important, since I'm calling in from United States, from Washington, it's important to say that US and Europe, for that matter, are not unhappy with this de-escalation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. I know some people have been commenting that this is a net loss for the West. Well, look, the fact that US couldn't be the force that mediates between Iran and Saudi Arabia might, in terms of prestige, have helped the Chinese side. But the fact is, it's not because the United States didn't want to mediate, because the Iranian side wasn't interested in the United States mediating. And I think in the long term, this Iranian obsession of keeping the United States out will be undermining Iranian interest in the region. Because as many Iranian commentators point out today and have been pointing out for months, this Iranian overdependence on China really will hurt Iranian economic interest in the long term, because the Chinese are less interested in Iran and more interested in the Gulf side. And despite what you have seen and heard in recent years, like the 25-year strategic agreement and so on, in reality, very little has happened in terms of Chinese major investment. What you happen to see is discounted Iranian crude oil going to China. That's a nice win for China. It doesn't serve long-term Iranian economic interest. So I will just put all this together and just summarize very quickly in one or two sentences. I'll stop. Iran and Saudi Arabia made this deal in March of this year for different reasons. I think the Saudis are clearly, to my mind, the ones that are being much more rewarded, because the heat that was coming on Saudi economic plans, Saudi society, in the shape of attacks by pro-Iran, let's call them that, Houthis in Yemen, that has definitely subsided. That's a win for Saudi Arabia, gives them breathing space. And the Iranian side right now can hope that they can, for example, shape Saudi Arabia's calculations in the region to peel Saudi Arabia off the United States, or maybe stop Saudi Arabia from joining the Abraham Accords. But these are all Iranian hopes. I think, if you just take the debate around whether Saudi Arabia will normalize relations with Israel, it's not what Iran has to say in that equation. It's what the Americans can help the Saudis get if they recognize Israel's right to exist as a nation state and a member of the 9 nations. So again, when I look at it, I think it's early days to say that Iran-Saudi cooperation is going to result in something major, big. Certainly, I don't think you can make a comparison to what is happening with the I2U2 or Abraham Accords. They're ahead. But I do hope, as somebody who believes the Middle East needs dialogue, the broader Middle East needs not only dialogue, economic cooperation, investing in one another's well-being. That's key for this region. Again, this is part of the world that is least economically connected compared to other regions of the world, the least. So that's, that is not good. If you could come to a point where Saudi investors invest in Iran and vice versa, that sort of reality would just reduce the logic of conflict and tensions. And that, I think, would be beneficial to the entire populations across the Middle East. Again, that is my Friday morning wishful thinking part, but I think that's what we can hope for, but that's a hope. In the short term, I don't see much being done in that regard, but even the fact that there is the political dialogue, the fact that the Saudis and the Iranians do sit and meet in itself should be welcome, should be encouraged, but we just need to be realistic about what it means in practical terms in the short term, while still hoping in the long term this could go somewhere for the benefit of the entire region. So let me stop there, Faraz. I talked about 7 minutes more than I had planned, but I'll stop here and let you take over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alex. It was indeed a comprehensive overview of the contemporary Middle Eastern proceedings, the way the Middle Eastern states are going to be reconciliatory towards each other. You have rightly pointed out that the current Saudi-Iran security cooperation is just a proposed one. And even if it is to be materialized anytime sooner, it would take time to compete with I2U2 because of the grand level of cooperation in I2U2 that aims to meet the Chinese PRI project. You have also mentioned that such sort of rapprochement from the Iranian perspective is aimed to prevent Saudi Arabia from joining the Abraham Accords, and it's in line with the Iranian policy of neighborhood first and look east policy. From the Saudi Arabian side, you have mentioned that such sort of rapprochement was a necessity given the huge and humongous amount of threats that Saudi economic projects would have been facing from the Iranian side or the Iranian partners in the Middle East. Linked to that, there are a couple of questions directed towards you. First question is by Ms. Arhama Siddiqa. She asked that how do you think that both Iran and Saudi Arabia, while Iran is now actually the member of SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and Saudi Arabia has also submitted its request to join the SCO. How do you think that such sort of membership, if Saudi Arabia also would be able to avail, would impact the Saudi and Iranian relationship, since both of them would be the part of a singular minilateral or multilateral alliance?
Right. Well, thank you for that question. Look, I'm not an expert on Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I would just say that, number one, any platform, any multilateral agency or framework that allows for political dialogue, for diplomacy to work, to create conditions for de-escalation, that's a kind of platform of that nature should be welcomed. In West Asia, for sure, broader West Asia, from Afghanistan to places like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, this region has suffered hugely. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people dead. Money that should be invested in basic necessities of life has been spent on weapon systems. And if you can reduce the logic of spending money on militaries and spending money on the livelihood of people, and if Shanghai Cooperation Organization can bring that about, then I say all the power to it. But the realist in me also says Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as you know, has been around since the mid-1990s. It began as a small effort by China and the post-Soviet Russian Federation to deal with their border disputes. It's come a long way since mid-1990s, but it was essentially aimed at security cooperation, dealing with things such as, for example, what Central Asia experienced in the 1990s, militant Islamism, so forth. As the organization has grown, now, as you know, India, Pakistan are members, Iran is a now member. The big test is how can they practically do the bigger, heavy lifting? To resolve your differences over a disputed border is one thing. To, for example, resolve Kashmir, and I'm getting into a territory I really shouldn't speak much about because that's not my area of expertise. But I haven't seen Shanghai Cooperation Organization do anything significant along those lines. So yes, frameworks, platforms that create the conditions for dialogue should be welcome. Essentially, are the only way forward, except to avoid military confrontation. But we also need to be realistic that when it comes to SCO, it has yet to prove itself. I cannot point to one event, one area of conflict, certainly nothing in terms of scale that Iran and Saudi Arabia need to resolve that has been solved by SCO. But again, I don't want to put cold water on it. I don't want to dismiss it, but I'm just saying that is one avenue forward. If you want to speed things up, I actually think the bilateral negotiations between Tehran and Riyadh is much preferred. It will speed things up. You will keep it simple between their differences. If Russia and China, the two big powers in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for whatever reason can help Iran and Saudi Arabia go down this path, again, that will be great. But the last few months, 7-8 months, President Xi's visit to the UAE, was it UAE or Saudi Arabia? I'm not sure, but his visit in December of last year, and this latest Russia GCC summit, where Russia and China both supported the Gulf position on the 3 disputed islands in the Persian Gulf, tells me that Russia and China are pursuing their own interest. They're not in this business of making everybody else happy. They're pursuing their own interest. And I think that should tell Iran and Saudi Arabia that if they're serious about resolving their differences, the best, fastest approach still is direct negotiations, as they have pursued in the last few years.
There is another question from my colleague, Mr. Imran Sardar. He's asking that, in your opinion, if the Saudi-Iran approach might not that sort of larger event that we could say a paradigm shift in the Middle East, and if, as you mentioned, that China is not so much interested in Iran as compared to its partnership with the Gulf states, then how do you analyze the status quo that is present in the Middle Eastern region, the US, Israel, and now the Chinese entry through Iran and Saudi Arabian approach?
Look, I mean, I spend most of my time focused on Iranian policy, and let me give you a reality that is openly discussed among analysts in Tehran. That their policy of never, essentially, I shouldn't exaggerate. The Iranian policy isn't never to talk to the United States, but it's to talk to the United States with conditions. You know, the Iranian argument, to be fair, let me put the Iranian official argument forward. The Iranian official argument is they reached a deal with the Americans back in 2015. President Trump came in and destroyed that deal. So the Iranians argue there is no trust in the Americans. You can't trust the Americans. But I actually think, while I think it was a mistake for the United States to walk away from that deal, for various reasons, I think that is true. Nonetheless, Iran, the Islamic Republic's hostility towards the United States go back to 1979. It's the part of the DNA of the Iranian regime. And I don't see how there can be a paradigm shift in the Middle East when it involves Iran, unless the Iranian side can look themselves in the eye and say, we need to really fundamentally change course when it comes to the United States for the sake of Iranian interest, for the sake of not being beholden to Russia and China. Because this is the sad situation the Islamic Republic is in today. The slogans of independence, that Iran had a revolution in 1979 with Ayatollah Khomeini to be independent, well, that independence doesn't exist in reality. Iran has one major economic partner. That's hardly independence. Their foreign policies isolated the country so much so that the other 200 plus countries out there ignore Iran. I mean, I'm exaggerating to some extent, but I think I'm making a point here that it's a foreign policy of the Islamic Republic of Iran that needs to take a fundamental shift away from the last 44 years to want to become a member, a normal member of the world community, not to pursue this idea of China and Russia can save them. The United States and the Europeans are declining powers, which are these old tired slogans we've heard for years. It would be much more beneficial for the Iranian national interest for them to, have a hard look at their foreign policy and then change accordingly. And I think once that happens, Iran will become not just more attractive for the likes of Saudi Arabia, but also of China. I mean, we just had a few weeks ago an interview by the former Iranian foreign minister, Ali Akbar Salehi. Ali Akbar Salehi was a foreign minister and openly says the Chinese told him, the Chinese, not the Americans, the Chinese told him, resolve your differences with the Americans, then we can invest in Iran. Because we, China, we're part of the global economy. We can't deal with a country like Iran that is so sanctioned. Our companies don't want to move in and be in danger of being penalized and sanctioned because of dealing with a sanctioned country. So in a sense, on the issue of paradigm shift, I think it's very easy to see the writing on the wall. It really goes back to the nature of Iranian foreign policy. Iran can be, look at Turkey today. Look at the major shifts in Turkish foreign policy the last year. Country that was at loggerheads with both Saudi Arabia and UAE today is talking about billions of dollars of investment, trade, and so on. Far more flexible Turkish foreign policy, benefits the Turkish economy. Compare that to the Iranian foreign policy. So intransigent. Iran basically has a few friends in the world: Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, maybe to some extent North Korea, not that it matters from an economic point of view. And that's about it. The neighboring states are, like I just described today with Saudi Arabia, are not forward-looking when it comes to Iran, just want to keep Iranian troublemaking away from them. That's all they want, because that's what geography dictates. This is a really tragic situation for a rich country like Iran, because, you know, this is a country of 5,000-year history, major economic potential, major, the largest oil and gas reserves in the world by any country. All of it is left essentially unused right now. And you want to find a solution to this. You want to have another look at foreign policy. But I hate to say this is not going to happen while Ali Khamenei is the Iranian supreme leader. The man is not ready to change, but the leadership that will come after him, they need to make a decision. What sort of Iran do they think their people deserve? Because if the Iranian people don't see change, the protests that you've seen in Iran in the last few months and few years will not go away. And not every Iranian has the option of emigrating. There will be enough angry people inside of Iran that will keep demanding change. And you know, again, that's a risk, a major risk for survival of the Iranian regime. It's the anger of Iranian society because of the economic conditions, the isolation, and so forth.
So yes, Mr. Alex, I agree with you on this point that there are very few allies and partners of Iran when it comes to the foreign policy because of the long-standing disputes that Iran has and its specific ideology that it practices. But one question from my side that if I analyze the current rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, I consider that it's a more win for Iran as compared to Saudi Arabia, because you see that the long-standing disputes in actually a long-standing war in Syria and Yemen, both of them were the Iranian partners or Iranian proxies for that matter. They are actually being legitimized after this rapprochement into the larger and the broader Middle East. You see that Bashar al-Assad has been warmly welcomed into the Arab League after a decade or so. Truly, it could be said for the Houthis that are in peace dealings with the Saudi Arabia. So in an overall scenario, we have seen that the Iranian position in the Middle East has actually strengthened, and the Abraham Accords that were speculated to isolate Iran regionally have sort of, you may say, could not produce their result to that extent that were hoped for. UAE has been in a high-level diplomatic engagement with Iran since 2019. So is the case with Turkey. Iraq is already the part of the Iranian so-called axis of resistance. So how do you visualize all this scenario that although, yes, Iran is isolated internationally, but regionally, Iran has been able to come out of that isolation and make diplomatic progress in terms of its relation with the regional states?
You know, I think what you just said is one of those key issues that has been debated in Tehran. On the one side, the proponents of Iranian foreign policy, as it has been exercised the last many years, certainly since 2011, when Iran doubled down on intervening in places like Syria, spearheaded by folks like Qasem Soleimani and the Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards, will make the argument that today Iran is more powerful. I would say that might have been true when ISIS was still around. At best, when ISIS could have threatened the Iranian homeland, given that it was anti-Shia, anti-Iran. But where is ISIS today? I mean, it's still out there on the margins, but hardly an existential threat. So when I look at it, I say to myself, here we are, 2023, over a decade after the Syrian civil war essentially started. What is it that Iran has to gain by being in Syria? It's not economic interest. I mean, the Iranian economic rewards from being in Syria are minimal. I mean, Iran has been subsidizing the Assad regime for years and continues to do so at an expense, a direct expense. So there's no economic benefit. So what else can we point to in terms of benefits? Well, the two arguments that you often hear is that Syria is essential for Iran to be able to continue to have a supply route to Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the other one is that you need Syria as a geographic place from from which you can project power over your ideological enemy, Israel, right? So I see sense in what Iran is doing at a very steep cost. If you think that the ideological priority of squeezing Israel through Hezbollah and being in Syria, so you can have those pro-Iran proxies aim their rockets at Israel, if that is your definition of success, well, then yes, Iran is succeeding. But that is not the concern of your average Iranian today. Your average Iranian today who is leaving the country, who's taking not just their labor and their knowledge, but also their money. Look at the capital flight. Look at the brain drain. I mean, Iran is literally losing its best and brightest every year. The more and more Iranians are leaving the country, moving to places like Canada. That's because that foreign policy I just described doesn't work for them. That's because they think it's better for them to go and buy a property in Dubai or in Tbilisi or in the beaches of Turkey than invest in their own home country. That's the disaster of Iranian foreign policy, because it's hollowed out any confidence inside the country among Iranian people in the future of their own country. So we can sit here and discuss about, the region, whether who's winning, who's losing. I'm telling you, the Iranian people feel that they're losing. And they are not just thinking it, they're acting as if it's happening. They're leaving, they're taking their money, they're sending their kids out. No country can live like this forever. No country can sit there and have this sort of immigration capital flight year after year. And that is a major, major crisis for Iran. Again, don't take my word for it. Listen to the Majlis, which is the weakest Majlis in the history of the Islamic Republic. They don't really have any power, but at least there's some, you can hear expressions of frustration even from people that are connected with the Islamic Republic. So I think that is how, another way of measuring, the health of Iranian regional and foreign policy. A foreign policy that is only an expense, that doesn't have benefits, essentially will run its course. And you can say the same thing has happened here in the United States with the pullout of Afghanistan, Iraq. I mean, why is the United States so reluctant to get involved in the Middle Eastern affairs again? Because it didn't work. It was a foreign policy that was just a cost, a burden on American taxpayer. So it's not limited to Iran. Any country that pursues a foreign policy that's only about cost and no benefits, essentially at some point will have to pay for it.
So basically, you argued that on the ideological front, externally, maybe Iran has been strengthened in the region, but internally and domestically, the relationship between the state and the society has been fractured, because the Iranian people consider themselves at the losing side, because the amount of money which Iranian people expect that to be invested on them are basically being utilized in the Iranian foreign policy goals and regional goals. So you rightly pointed out. Just one last question, Mr. Alex, and that is related to this one, but from the Saudi perspective, that we have seen in recent years that Saudi regional influence have been on the declining side. Specifically after the Yemen war. Many analysts have considered that Saudi Arabia entrance into the Yemen war has basically exposed Saudi's vulnerability to non-state actors like Houthis. And also we have seen that there are rival states that are trying to compete with Saudi Arabia in the Arab world and to exclude and escape out of the Saudi big brotherly role, for example, UAE, for example, Qatar. So how do you visualize all these intra-Arab relations and Saudi's vulnerability being the basic cause of rejoining alliances or rejoining diplomatic ties with Iran and other countries, particularly when the traditional security guarantor of Saudi Arabia, that is the US, the relationship with US is also at the daunting side with this current Biden administration?
Thank you, Faraz. I'll be very quick, and I want to link up to something you say in your remarks earlier. But look, on this issue of the region is definitely moving in a different direction. I mean, the zero-sum competition, UAE, Saudi, Qatar, they were involved in Libya, they were involved in Syria, they were involved in Yemen, they were involved in places like East Africa, Somalia, and elsewhere. the region has, by and large, those countries that invested financially and otherwise in those sort of competitions have decided this is not worth it. This is too much expense for little return. And I think that's a good decision. They still, as you pointed out, have their own competition. I think some of those the accounts you've been hearing are exaggerated. I mean, this latest with UAE and Saudi Arabia being competing for the top role as the key states in the region. I think that's exaggerated. Of course, they have differences. That's hardly a secret. But are they going to go out and have a conflict of sorts? I think, again, that is exaggerated. But I think overall, if the region continues this path where you see de-escalation, I mean, from the Turks to the Egyptians to the Gulfies and the Iranians, there's a major amount of goodwill right now that is arguing for diplomacy and de-escalation. This is exactly what the broader Middle East needs, right? I would say final point, and linking again to what you said, whether Iran's foreign policy has been a success from an ideological point of view in the region. Yes, in the sense that they kept Assad in power. Now, I don't know if Assad is in power today because of Qasem Soleimani and Iran or because of the Russian Air Force. I don't think anybody knows that. But it wasn't just Iran that kept them, kept Assad in power. My point is this, that, when I look, again, going back to the core of our discussion today, Iran, Saudi Arabia. Here you have a leadership. I think Mohammed bin Salman is 37, 38. He has made some horrendous mistakes getting involved in Yemen. The case of Jamal Khashoggi. These are terrible in terms of his record. But people shouldn't forget the other things he's been doing. Opening up Saudi society, having essentially an ability to listen to his his contemporaries, the Saudis of his age group or younger. I mean, I think Mohammed bin Salman is 37, 38. Compare that to Ali Khamenei, age of 84, who simply refuses to listen to his own people. So when I'm thinking long-term, where is the Middle East going? It doesn't even matter what the Iranian model is, what the Saudi model is. I happen to think if a ruling elite is in touch with their own people, that's the better way forward. Then it's a no-brainer. It's the Saudi side right now that is much more in sync with the aspiration of their youth, certainly, than what we have in Iran. And that's why I have my doubts about whether the Iranian regime can continue to be on the path it's been on, both in terms of domestic policy. Taking one example, the forced hijab. How can you force people to be good Muslims and an approach that is opposite to what the Saudis are doing? That's essentially right now one of the key challenges of the region. Do you want forced Islam, or do you want an Islam that is put in the heart of the people through arguments and other approaches that will make people want to live a certain life as opposed to being forced to live a certain life? So anyway, I just wanted to wrap it up by making that comparison between where Iran is today and where Saudi Arabia is. But final point, I really think it's important for the region, regardless of who is in power in Tehran and Riyadh, that these two major countries have discussions, pursue de-escalation, spend their monies on their economies, on the well-being of their citizens, as opposed to what we've seen in the last few decades, scoring points, spending money on supporting proxy groups against each other, undercutting each other at any expense. That has been nothing but disastrous for the broader Middle East. And if we can see the end of that, I think the region should welcome it.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alex. On this note, that the Middle Eastern states should come together and join hands toward the mutual prosperity and progress of their states and the people. Now I would like to invite President IRS Ambassador Nadeem Rayas to have the concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Faraz. It was really a pleasure listening to you, Alex. I thoroughly enjoyed the discussion. I mean, you were very, very crisp, you were precise, and you really answered the questions in a manner which I really liked, because you were being upfront. You basically spoke from your heart, as this. Well, I should have said good morning to you first, because I know it's early on in Washington, while we are basically, ending our day and heading towards the weekend. But I have a few, very few comments, because, after everything has been said, it's always very difficult to conclude. But I will also speak from my heart, and I will tell you what I feel about the entire. Well, I think it's really too early, because there's a lot of talk about the rapprochement, but actually on ground, very little has been. So while we hope for the best, we should also be realistic as to how things are going to move forward. Obviously, this rapprochement has the security as well as the economic dimensions, and both these dimensions, in a way, are beneficial to both Saudi Arabia and to Iran. Obviously, with this particular thing on the ground, the Iranians have got much more opportunities to actually improve their economy, which is really in need of that, because of the sanctions, which have hurt the Iranian public as well as the state of Iran quite a lot in the last few years. Then obviously, the Saudis have also benefited from the entire thing. They have a sort of a peace going on with Yemen, and Yemen is a country which could harm their interest in the region. I think the rapprochement has been beneficial also for the West as well as for the EU countries. But again, one has to see how this rapprochement pans out for the other countries of the world to actually benefit from it. The Chinese role has been important, but I think basically the Chinese want stability in the Middle East, because if you look at the larger Chinese aim, it is economic outreach and connectivity. And that really can't move forward without having a lasting peace in the Middle East, which has been a region which has remained fairly turbulent in the last number of years. I think as far as the economic collaboration in the Middle East is concerned, along with this rapprochement, and if you once tries to compare it with what is going on in the EU, I think we are years behind. The I2U2, the topic which we actually started with, well, that's also a new concept. It's no more than 2.5 to 3 years old. And I don't really think that a sort of a collaboration on those lines is anywhere on the cards in the near or the immediate future between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Although we hope that, they will continue to work closely with one another for betterment in the Gulf. But then we must remain cognizant to the role of spoilers, because there are many spoilers. I'm not only talking about states, I'm talking about the non-state actors, which actually would have a role to play in this rapprochement. But you see, the basic thing is that I think one of the biggest hurdles which needs to be crossed by both these countries is the issue of perceptions. Perceptions, as well as the suspicions and the trust deficit which does exist. And I think that is one thing which actually needs to be bridged. But one of the most important positive developments is that Iran and Saudi Arabia are talking to one another. Diplomatic relations have been established. Iran has, I think, also nominated its ambassador. And I don't know if the gentleman has taken up his assignment or not, but that's a very positive development. We still await development on this thing, on the appointment of ambassador and actually placement from this. But I think one key thing which we must realize that as far as the United States, Russia, China, all these countries, they will continue to have their own interests. And they will tailor their policies to actually meet these interests. I think the global order is undergoing a transformation. I don't need to go into the details of that, but obviously this transformation is also going to affect in some way the possible rapprochement and the ties between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I think the conflict which is going on in Ukraine, its impact on the food security, its impact on the energy, and its impact on the geostrategy will also have its imprint on the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I think a good step has been taken, and let's hope for the best. That's what I basically hope for, and I honestly feel that there is. I think we should look positively towards the entire thing, and then let's see how it goes. Because I think it's an evolving situation, and it's something which we all need to think positively. And as people working in the think tanks, I think we should give more positivity than negativity towards that. Well, that's all I had to say. But thank you very much. It was really a very, very interesting discussion, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And what I basically spoke is from the bottom of my heart. Like, this is the way I feel about it. And thank you very much for taking the time to join us so early on in the morning. And I wish you a great weekend, which is just around the corner. Over to you, Faraz.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for your concluding remarks. Mr. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. We are truly honored and indebted. And it was thoroughly an enlightening discussion, and we have learned a lot from this. And hopefully in future events, we are going to invite you again for some other topic, some other day, and would be learning from your knowledge and experience as well. Thank you so much, Mr. Alex.
Thank you, Faraz. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Ambassador Riaz for his concluding remarks, his kind words. Thank you for joining us, for the wonderful questions. I hope we can do this again. And I do hope I get back to visit beautiful Pakistan. It's been 10 years since I was there last, but I'm a big fan. So I hope I might see some of you in person, hopefully, inshallah, in the near future in person. So thanks again for having me.
Inshallah, Alex, and it will be a pleasure if you could visit Pakistan, and we would definitely organize an event for you at the Institute. And then, you can also spend time with my researchers, and you can basically, we could get people from a cross section of the society, so that you can not only know about Pakistan-Iran relationship, but also about the region, which I think is a region which is of immense importance to the world. I mean, forget about any geostrategy or anything. Just look at the number of people who reside here. It's 1/5 of the world population. We keenly look forward to welcoming you in Pakistan.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I look forward to it.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Mr. Alex. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.